inspections. My name is Roger Beekman. I'm the Produce Safety Program Manager based out of Olympia. Some of the rest of the staff is here. If you could just raise your hand, and they're going to be presenting as well, so they can introduce themselves in a bit more detail to get to that point. So Jill Weishart, based in Olympia. Beth here, actually based in Bellingham. And then Karen Ullman is our outreach person. And then Elle over there, she's with regional marketing. Is that what it's took? Okay. So again, that's kind of the staff. So if we could just get started, next slide, please. Or do I do that? Just, there we go. Okay, we're going to cover the agenda. And then
I'm going to do this real fast just so I can see something, because I think he's speaking kind of faintly.
Washington State, kind of where we
I want to see where he is to the microphone.
Some of the basic questions is, are you covered? And I know that's going to be of immediate concern for some, and then it'll be phased in over time. So we'll get more detail about that. The year in review, kind of as things have progressed, we've been doing a lot of work with FDA. FDA has been very cooperative actually in the last few years in terms of taking a look at the rule, getting feedback from various sources, and then adjusting based on the information that they have. So that's been very helpful. And then also primarily
yes, let me see.
For the rule and to make sure things go well when the time comes for it.
Hey, so what you can do, you guys, I'm going to turn this down. If you want a folder, what you can do is I will I will send a piece of paper around. You can write your address on it to me, and I'm going to tell their technician over text. Just stick one in the mail to you guys, okay?
A couple. A resource person, I guess that would be like and things like that. We've got a few people there. I'm sure there's other similar numbers in the other locations. Academic or student, I'm sure WSU has got some people on the east side, and then others that might be here. Okay. And I guess the next question is to kind of get a feel as to where we are in terms of everybody's knowledge. When you heard the term FSMA, how much do you know about this? So which best applies? How many have never heard of it before and know nothing more about it other than the initials? Okay, everybody's at least heard of it. How many have a little bit of knowledge of FSMA? Yeah, there's a few. How many have somewhat knowledge? Okay, so we're kind of in the middle ground there. How many know the rule quite well? How many of you could have written the rule? Yeah, very well. So that's kind of where we're in this situation too, because it is kind of a living document, but it looks like there's a fair number of people here who've got some experience with at least understanding kind of where they are now. And I'm sure that will be very helpful in terms of questions and answers, because you've done enough research to ask very specific questions, and we'll answer those as best we can when the time comes. Okay, just kind of a brief view of the General Food Safety Modernization Act. There are basically 7 rules to the act, and you can see them pop up here on the screens. The one obviously we're concerned about, and we'll talk about in more detail today, is the produce safety rule. They're also going to be the partner program to this in terms of a lot of effort is the preventive controls for human food. You may or may not fall under that category based on your situation. Sanitary transportation of food. This does not cover the actual transportation vehicles that are used on the farm. However, some of the principles are probably the same. Preventive controls for animal feed, probably not critical in terms of this audience. Foreign supplier verification program. What the intent of the FDA in this rule is that produce that is entering the U.S. market has to meet equivalent standards in terms of what the expectations are. And I know that's been a concern for a lot of people. It's like, well, here's all the things we have to do to comply to the rule, but what about our competitors in these other countries? Are they being held to the same standard? Because there's a cost aspect to this, and we understand that. Another aspect of the rule is the intentional alteration of food. This is kind of steps taken to ensure that there's no terrorism acts or acts of those kind that are inflicted upon the food supply, and the accreditation of the third-party certification. These are the auditors that will actually go out to these farms and facilities in other countries and ensure that they are meeting the same standards and expectations of the produce safety rule. That's primarily what we're concerned about. So are there any questions up to this point? No, again, this is the produce safety rule, the one that we're primarily focused on. And again, coming back to some of the history about this, it goes back to the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And it's kind of been an arc ever since then. It really hasn't had a major overhaul since then. The intent now is to take a look at, and it talks about unadulterated foods, to take a look at prevention as opposed to reaction. So the intent is to be proactive.
And the reminder here is that we will go through exemptions. So some farms in here may be excluded from the rule because of their size or the markets that they're selling into. Even if that's the case, the adulteration rule that was established in 1938 is still a live and active requirement. So even if you're excluded from the FSMA rule, there's still a requirement for farms not to sell adulterated food.
Is this the part where I'm supposed to hand off to somebody? Okay. If you got any questions.
So we've got a little, just a little high level 2-minute video just to show you guys a little bit about Food Safety 101.
It takes a lot of effort to make sure what we eat doesn't harm us. From 1996 to 2010, approximately 23% of all foodborne illness outbreaks in the U.S. were caused by produce. Our goal is to help prevent contamination where food production starts, on the farm. There are many ways our fresh veggies and fruits can become contaminated, but many times it involves the introduction of harmful microorganisms or pathogens during production. Once a pathogen has made its way onto produce, it's very hard to remove. Let's discuss the programs that you, as a grower, can develop to prevent this from occurring. Test your water supply to ensure it meets federal regulations and take steps to reduce upstream contamination. Make sure bordering neighbors aren't spreading contamination onto your farm. Regularly scout for signs of animal activity and feces, and use fences, decoys, and deterrents to keep animals away from growing areas. Create dedicated and well-maintained areas for your workers to eat, drink, and use the restrooms. It's best to only use treated soil amendments, but if you apply untreated soil amendments, do so early in the season, and make sure it does not come in contact with the harvestable portion of the plant. Cover manure and other soil amendments to prevent them from contaminating produce during windy days and from water runoff on rainy days. Don't harvest produce that shows signs of contamination. Ensure employees change clothing, boots, and gloves after contact with animals or feces, or when they show signs of wear or are dirty. Review food safety policies and precautions with workers, so everyone understands their part in making sure your produce makes its way to the table safely. Produce safety begins on the farm. By taking these steps, you can deliver the healthiest produce to consumers and prevent foodborne illness from occurring. For more information, visit foodsafety.wsu.edu.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about what is involved in produce inspection very briefly, because obviously it's a little more in depth than this presentation we'll get into. This is our department. Jill is here, Karen's here, Roger's here, I'm here. We do have two other inspectors, that one is located in Wenatchee and one is in Olympia. And then Lindsay is also in Olympia as well. So routine inspections, they will be pre-scheduled. I will call you to set that up. Chances are during harvest or when there's harvest activities, we'll find a time to come out there and do the inspections. There hopefully will at the time be a person that is designated to walk around with me. That person needs to have gone through that grower training that we are doing right now. A lot of people are going through that. And as far as who is going to be inspected and what year, because we're just beginning this, and we can't start every single farm the first year, it's going to be based on a couple of different items. And these items in this that are listed are the size of your farm is going to be taken into consideration, your history of a recall, any education, if you've had previous GAT certification or any other audits. These things are going to be taken into account when prioritizing the farms that we're going to be beginning with. Oh, yes. Mhm. Yes. Okay, sure. So the question was, if other third-party certifications, are we including other certifications aside from USDA GAP? And yes, I would say we are going to be looking at other third-party certifications. Yes, exactly. Okay. So when we're doing inspections, we're going to be looking at the farm as a whole, but these are 5 key subparts that we're going to be focusing on to ensure that we can reduce risk of contamination of the food. First is going to be humans. Obviously, that's a huge risk. Animals, then you have your soil and your water. And then you have to always remember cleaning and sanitizing of your tools, of your equipment, and any food contact surfaces. So we'll start with the humans. Humans, if you guys have those books of the actual regulation, they are in humans are covered in subpart D, which is under worker health, training, and hygiene. So I'm going to be looking at training, mostly records. I'll be observing your harvesting activities, making sure that your workers have adequate training for what they're going to be doing. And that they're not eating, drinking, smoking, contaminating food, washing their hands, using the bathroom. All these things will try to be observed during the inspection.
And to just drive home this point, you have to keep in mind that we can't see or smell pathogens, and we're not necessarily going to be going out and doing any kind of swabbing or testing on your farm. So your worker training, seeing records of training, seeing it live and in person is really going to be our main way to confirm that you're following through with food safety. So that's why it's its own subpart, but it's also a theme of the whole rule, that workers know what the practices are on the farm, and that the food safety managers are also modeling those practices.
Right, exactly. And just to stress, employee training that is adequate for what the employee will be doing. Can't just have employee training for everything if they're going to be doing something, that's not really related to training. Okay, so we'll just kind of do a show of hands now. When is hand washing not required? So I'm just going to go through the responses, and if you raise your hand when I get to the correct response, we can just see how many people, I guess, think that is the correct response. So how many people think that before starting your work is not required to wash your hands? Or before putting on gloves? What about after using the toilet? After harvesting produce? Okay, good, yeah. So we had a system set up that actually didn't work with the third party that we are presenting in. So this was supposed to be able to be responded via text, but we'll just do a hand raising thing because there's a couple questions throughout the presentations. So yes, that is correct. Hand washing is not required after you're harvesting produce, but the rule does state that if you are, basically anytime you feel the need, like if your hands are soiled at any point, sometimes after harvesting you get muddy, you're going to probably want to wash your hands anyway, but it's not required. All the other ones definitely are.
So it's interesting. The other options in this question are actually specific lines within the rule. So if you have a food safety plan, or if you're in the process of developing a food safety plan, these would be good steps to include in that plan, or in your
SOPs,
your standard operating procedures, to inform employees, like, okay, here are times that you would be wanting to wash your hands. So the rule also includes just a general statement, to wash your hands at any other time that would be reasonable after,
I would definitely on this list also include after eating or drinking as well, which is not on here, but it's definitely
important. This is one of the areas where the rule is actually pretty specific. There's other areas of the rule that may be broad in terms of interpretation and implementation, but this is one specific area. So we like to throw that in as one, okay, this is something you could take home and try to enforce on your operation.
Okay. Second, we're going to talk about animals. This is in subpart I of the rule. It includes both domestic and wild animals. So what we would be like looking for when we're out on an inspection is that you are monitoring and that we are not observing animals contaminating the produce. Now, I know this is like, you're outside, it's a farm, you can't prevent birds from flying over stuff, but really what we're going to be looking for is potential risk of contaminating the crops. If I see feces while I'm out on the field, it might be questionable. If I see a deer that's field over, it's not going to be an issue. But we do want to see, taking precautions to set up barriers. We want to see, maybe if you are worried about birds, you want to put up some scare tape or other tactics of preventing birds from potentially contaminating your crops. But it's not going to be one of those things where I'm going to come out and say, I see a bird, that's a violation. So, but definitely we're going to be looking at you're taking the right steps to prevent animals. And same thing with domestic animals as well. I don't want to see a dog peeing on your lettuce or something like that while I'm out there. And if you have U-pick, same thing. Make sure the rules state you don't have pets in the field, because you don't want to have just a bunch of people's animals running around in your fields.
And understandably, it will happen
Mhm.
that there'll be animals
That's
who,
that's what I'm trying to
drop
say.
feces into your cropland. Really, what we're looking for is that you're not harvesting that product. That's like
the next
the
step.
main.
This little flag, if you've noticed that there's some sort of contamination, we don't want you to harvest it. And if I see that while I'm on an inspection that there is contamination, but you've marked it, that's going to be great. I would say that that's a wonderful, that's what you should be doing. And make sure, and this is kind of going to be a theme, records for this one would be monitoring and corrective actions, as we discussed. Make sure you have monitoring records and things that you're doing to fix the problem. The next one would be soil. So if any of you use biological soil amendments of animal origin, this one can seem complicated, but it's really not. The main thing is if you are using biological soil amendments, ensure that there's a large amount of time before harvesting your produce. If you do have, I guess going back to the animal thing also, and kind of related to this, if you do have grazing animals on your land as well, you want to make sure that there's a big time interval before you're harvesting produce, things like that.
And FDA doesn't define what that interval is at this time.
Not at this point.
At this point, it's just a recommendation to have as large of an interval.
Yeah.
as possible. They're looking into specifically for.
Oh, yeah. If you guys want to text questions,
biological
509.
amendments of animal.
788.
I know that's a mouthful, but basically that's going to be raw manure or any other compost type product that you're adding to the cropland that includes
5459.
byproducts.
It can be anything like bone meal.
Hey, Kevin, do you have my phone number if you need to text a question?
The feathers, anything that's coming from an animal.
Okay.
So specific for those untreated raw manures, FDA has reserved that section for further research before determining a specific time interval for you guys. But they have, if you guys are already following like organic standards, or you're familiar with organic standards, organic uses a 90, 120 day interval, depending on whether it's in contact with the crop. That would be like a recommended time interval, although not enforced by the rule.
Exactly. But if you are using treated biological soil amendments of animal origin or untreated, make sure you have records of the treatment and as well the application process. So we can just take a look at that. A lot of these inspections are going to be going over records and ensuring that you have everything organized and you can document exactly what you're doing on your farm. Next is water. This is subpart E. This is a big, huge part of the rule that is kind of on hold still. So the ag water is defined as intended to or likely to contact covered produce or food contact surfaces. So there's a lot of questions about what if I have drip and it's not touching my food. That's going to be something that I'm not really too concerned with. It's going to be more important to inspect the water systems or look at the water if your water is actually coming in contact with your harvestable portion of your produce that people are going to actually consume. Or the water comes in contact with your food contact surfaces in your warehouses or anything like that. So for now, I'm just going to be going through the water sources, making sure everything is looking okay. And we are not testing But we definitely recommend that you guys, if you haven't taken a test of your water system and you have no idea about your water, at this point, it's now, since we're not enforcing anything yet, it's now the time to do it, to get your water system, understand it, get your couple of the tests back, the generic E. coli tests. I mean, I would recommend testing it as much as you can at this point to understand it, because the water pool is going to be a rolling average. So the more samples you have, the easier it is for us to evaluate your system, especially once we start inspecting that through the rule.
And we'll talk more about that.
Yeah,
too.
that'll
We're going to
come
talk
up
more
again.
about what the status is of the water aspect
Right.
of the rule. It's being re-looked at.
Mhm.
But the take home right now is to know that, understand what agricultural water is. It's one of the FDA terms that's defined in the rule. So we're really looking at water that's contacting the harvestable part of the crop.
And there's two, you have pre-production and post-production water, and really your post-production water is the water that we want to see having 0 detectable E. coli, because that's going to be your potable water. That's what you're washing your hands with, you're cleaning your food contact surfaces, and you're potentially washing your produce with that. That's another thing. We don't require you to wash produce, but if you are, make sure that it's got 0 detectable E. coli. The pre-production water is a little bit different. There's some standards that they're going off of. We'll get into that later in the presentation. But definitely for your post-production water has to be E. coli free. And for the records, your annual water monitoring, if you haven't done it, I recommend doing it. If you have municipal water, make sure you get that from Department of Ecology. Any lab test results that you've done on your system, make sure you have all that stuff, because I'm going to want to look at it, even though, we're not really enforcing it, but it's good practice. Okay, so, and the last part would be tools. So everyone uses tools. I've mentioned any water that you're using to sanitize or clean your tools has to be potable water. So, there's one more, yeah. Okay, so going back to SOPs and documents, make sure if you do have a food safety plan that you are actually able to follow what's in the food safety plan. If you have SOPs in place, but you're not doing them because you just wrote them out and you think that's what you're supposed to be doing, but it's not able to be done at your farm, don't make those SOPs yours. Make sure that the things that you're doing for cleaning and sanitizing schedules, that they work for you. So if you have a harvester in the field and you want to sanitize it once a week, that's fine if it works for you. You don't have to do it every single day. It just has to be reasonable and it has to work for your farm. Don't write in your food safety plan, we sanitize it every single day, and then you do it once a month. It's just, make sure if you're writing things down that you're able to actually follow the SOPs. Do you have anything to add?
I would just emphasize that cleaning and sanitizing is required for food contact surfaces. So the rule draws the line between non-food contact and food contact surfaces, and it's the food contact surfaces that really emphasize the cleaning and sanitizing. It's up to you guys. Whatever rule says you need to set some sort of schedule for cleaning and sanitizing, but it's really upon you to decide what that schedule is.
Exactly. Whatever works for you.
So we'll just be looking to confirm that via records that the schedule that you set is being followed through with. Right.
Back to the records. Have records of your schedules. Make sure they're reasonable. If I go through and see it's unreasonable, it might be questionable. But if I'm looking at your records and that's what I see you doing, that's all that we really want to make sure of. Okay, we'll do another question.
Let's have.
Okay, question. Go ahead.
That they only have to wash their equipment once a week. As a packer, as a person who buys fruit, that's not right. And I think for food safety purposes, it should be done on at least a daily basis.
Oh, I just used the example of a harvester because people end up leaving those in the field. But I'm just saying, what works for you as far as packing, you're there every day. You should be cleaning it every single day. Okay.
So in terms of the cleaning and sanitize, you want to be careful what you wish for, right? So the rule does not specify what you're cleaning, the frequency of your cleaning and sanitizing at this point. It's up to the grower to make that determination. We can help work with you based on the case-by-case situation of what would be ideal for that. But it doesn't specify within the rule. So
yeah. Anyone else?
So let's have someone, maybe we can have an audience member say what they think the answer is to this question. So the question is,
during routine inspections, which sampling will be conducted? None of the above. Yeah, we're not going to be taking any samples. So that was basically what we wanted to. There's a lot of myths floating around that people think we're going to come in and start sampling everyone's product and taking environmental samples of everything, and we're not doing that. So we just wanted to put that out there that won't be done on a regular inspection.
Right. So this is applicable to routine inspections. Of course, if there's a for-cause investigation,
yes,
that would be different.
Yeah.
But in terms of routine inspections, we're not doing any kind of testing of product.
Right. And lastly, as we've gone through every single slide, you'll notice at the bottom there's records that you're going to want to keep for every single process that you're doing to make sure for yourself, for the inspection, it's a good liability. Make sure that you have especially your worker training records, they're required, cleaning and sanitizing templates, any sort of paperwork you need for your qualified exemption. Food, as mentioned, I guess we mentioned it, food safety plans are not required under the rule, but they're definitely a positive thing as long as you can follow them. Like I mentioned, if you have a food safety plan, you're not following it, that's going to be working to your disadvantage. If you do have one, we'll sit down and go through it. But definitely just keep every document that you can possibly imagine. So that will make the inspection process a lot faster.
And for those of you that just trickled in, there are folders here of resources that we're going to be mentioning throughout the presentation. So if you want to, there's some more on the table up here. And included in that folder is this record keeping template sheet that you see in the slides. This is a list of about the top 10 primary records that are required under the rule, if applicable. So if you're not treating there's an example here of if, for example, you were making treated compost on your farm and you were tracking temperature, time, and turning records, there's an example template in here that you could use for that. And that would just apply if you are actually following through with that practice, if you were doing that practice on your farm. So this is a template sheet created by the Produce Safety Alliance, who's one of the main educators on the rule at this time. This is here in hard copy for you in your folders. It's also available online if you want to download it. By no means are you required to use these templates, but they're just these templates exactly, but you could download them, modify them for your use. So it's just a recommendation.
Okay. All right. So you, here.
Okay, so in this section, I want to cover, are you covered? So what do I mean by that? So I don't know if you guys already know if you're covered by the rule or not, but what it means, being covered by the rule means that you're subject to follow or fall within the rule. So the next couple of slides, we're gonna go through what are some of the exemptions and exclusions from the rule. So if you're covered by the rule, that means that you may be inspected in the future. So let's go through some of those. Okay, so covered produce is produce that falls within the confines of the rule. So when we talk about the produce safety rule, we're really talking about fresh fruits and vegetables, also mushrooms, sprouts, peanuts, tree nuts, and herbs. It's not including food grains, for example. And really the reason for that is oftentimes food grains are going through an additional processing step. So food grains are not covered under this rule. So if you're growing food grains, this rule will not be applicable. It does not mean that other state or federal regulations may apply, but as it relates to the produce rule, that would not be applicable. Okay, so in addition, so the produce rule is covering fresh fruits and vegetables. There are some aspects that you may be excluded from the rule. So there's just 3 here that I'll go over. So if you're growing for just your own personal consumption, that would not be covered under the rule. If you are selling to commercial processing, so if it's going to go through a kill step and you're able to provide documentation of that kill step, that fresh produce that's going into that commercial processing may be able to have an exclusion from the rule with proper documentation. The other exclusion from the rule is that FDA has developed a list of rarely consumed raw products. So they've established an exhaustive list based on survey research of these following items. So if you grow any of these items would actually be excluded from the rule or would not be inspected under our authority. I know that some people have found this list to be, some of the items on this list to be a little bit unexpected, but this is based on FDA research and data, and they have a fact sheet on this if you wanted to know a little bit more about what these exclusions are and why. But the reason and thinking behind it is that potatoes, for example, typically are going to be cooked and go through a kill step. So that's the reason why they're not included within the rule. Okay. So I also want to now go over some of the small farm exemptions. So there's basically 2 tiers of this. The first one is there's a full exemption for very small farms. FDA defines this as less than 25,000 average annual produce sales. So this is taken based on your sales, calculated every year, and then averaged over the last 3 years. So if your sales are under that threshold, then you have a full exemption or exclusion from the rule. Now there's a second tier of category. These are called your qualified exempt farms. Qualified exempt farms must follow modified aspects of the rule, and it's based on 2 factors. One factor is based on your sales, and the other factor is based on your markets. So I have those listed out here. So the first one is the sales threshold. So that's less than $500,000 average annual food sales. And I highlight food sales there because the other exemption is based on produce sales. For qualified exemptions, actually based on your food sales. And what does food include? Well, FDA defines food as anything that's consumed by humans or animals. So this could be hay, it could be dairy, it could even be bottled water. It could be processed food. So it's really, you want to, if you're a diversified operation or business, you want to be thinking about all of your food sales in total. The second component is FDA is looking at, they've excluded some what are similar to direct-to-consumer direct-to-consumers, but they use the term qualified end users, and they define that as either the consumer, so selling right to a consumer via a CSA or farmer's market, for example, or a restaurant or retail food establishment within a certain area. So basically within the states, because our state's approximately around 275 miles long. So those are the 2 standards. A retail food establishment would include a grocery store, retail, a business that's selling majority of their sales right to a consumer as well. So, and the reason for all of this is that, or at least the thinking behind this is that FDA wants to try to reduce as much risk as possible. In those direct-to-consumer markets, there's less entry points for there to be other complications just in the supply chain where there may be more interest. So that's the reason why, and the thinking behind why why there's this qualified exempt farm exclusion, qualified farm exemption. So, okay, so if you're thinking to yourself in the room, okay, the qualified exemption may apply to me. If that's the case, okay, what are those modified requirements that I need to follow? Let's go over those. Number one, and this applies to everyone here, you should be keeping sales records to establish where you fall within the rule. We are not, FDA is not requiring you to register as a farm, as they may, for those of you that are processors and may need to register as facilities under the preventive controls rule. FDA is not requiring you to register, although if any authority were to ask for records to verify, you would need to have those on hand. So for farms, you would want to keep your sales records because you want to be able to show how much you're selling into who, because that would help determine if you fall within the qualified exemption. And so every year, I would recommend reviewing those, calculating what your total is for the year, and signing that off. So that would be what a record would look like related to that. Okay, so if you've gone through all of that and you know that you're still qualified exemption, the requirement for you is to have a food packaging label by 2020. So within 2 years, the requirement is to identify the source of the product, including farm name and business address. So the rule is fairly vague in how this could look. It just needs to be displayed prominently and conspicuously. Some recommendations for how that could look or be implemented would be, it could be a label at a farmer's market, it could be on a poster, it could be on a sign. It doesn't need to get drilled down to the PLU level. It can look at a couple different ways. This aspect applies to qualified exempt farms. It doesn't necessarily apply to covered farms that are larger than this, although it wouldn't hurt to have source identification if you're able to find a way to do that for your business. Questions on that? Okay, so I'd like to do a little knowledge check to kind of keep you guys engaged and to see if you're following those status qualified exemption requirements, because I think it can be kind of confusing. So let's take an example. Hayden's Heavenly Blueberries in Skagit County sells a diversity of berries through her farm stand at $10,000, through farmers markets at also $10,000, and to a local smoothie shop for $10,000. So she's basically selling direct to consumer here. She's selling to direct to consumer. Farmers markets would be considered a retail food establishment. A local food smoothie shop would be considered a retail food establishment. So essentially $30,000 to qualified end user. She also sells her largest crop, blueberries, to a packing house for wider distribution at $200,000 annually. So is Hayden qualified exempt, qualified exempt, or covered? Do we have any brave audience members who want to? Covered, yes, she's covered. Do you want to try to explain that?
Thousands more than half of the value, so, and I'm expecting that it's being exported further than the distance requirement.
That's exactly right. So I'll just repeat that for you guys here. The majority of the sales are going to a packing house, which is not a qualified end user. Oh, wait. Oh, no. So this would be qualified exempt because she's, covered, sorry. Covered, because the majority of sales, yes, are to a packing house. So she's not meeting that majority threshold. That's right. So covered. Okay. So let's do, I like this one. We've got. Okay, so how about another one? Rocco's Ranch in Chelan County raises high-quality beef for regional restaurants at $100,000 and ships to consumers nationwide through online sales at $160,000. In addition, Rocco sells several acres of potatoes at $20,000, carrots at $20,000 for 2 restaurants. Is Rocco's Ranch exempt, qualified exempt, or covered? Anyone want to take a stab at this? Okay. So Rocco is not exempt because Rocco is not under less than 25,000 average annual produce sales. So even though potatoes are rarely consumed raw, Rocco has 40,000 total average annual produce sales, so Rocco would not be exempt. Although Rocco would be qualified exempt because the majority of his sales are to qualified end users. So all of Rocco's sales are to qualified end users. Even though Rocco is selling nationwide, he's selling direct to consumer through his online sales. Okay. Now, qualified exempt farms, you'll need to keep sales records in order to verify where you fall within the rule, but qualified exempt farms will not undergo a routine inspection. So if you do not meet the exemption or the qualified exemption, you may be inspected at some point in the next several years. To know when that inspection might happen, you would use this chart. And the inspection timelines are scaled based on your size. So these thresholds, so business size is based on your produce sales. So in this instance, it's produce sales. So you'll notice here that compliance dates for all other businesses or those very large farms are already in effect. However, we've postponed inspections until next year. So inspections will be starting for those very large farms in the next year. I just
wanted to add about the qualified and not qualified, the qualified exempt. We won't be doing a routine inspection, but as I think you might have mentioned, I just want to reiterate, we will have to review some documents, probably annually, to maintain your qualified exempt status. So you will have some sort of records review, but might not be an on-site inspection per se.
Yeah, so we may be reaching out to verify the qualified exemption, but qualified exempt farms will not be going through a routine inspection, which is going out and going through the whole process, looking at your operation. So you also note here, and I'll be diving into this a little bit more, but the compliance dates for water requirements are farther out than general requirements for all their aspects of the rule. This is to give farms time to do their water testing requirements. These dates have, since as of last year, have been extended even farther. So FDA has proposed to extend those even farther to these dates out here. These dates are 4 years beyond your general compliance date. This is the date by which the last date by which you would want to at least start doing testing, as it's testing for water. That said, FDA is reviewing the water section of the rule, and we're going to talk about where we are with all of that in the next section. Okay, so we just went through all the coverages of whether or not you're covered with the rule, or maybe you're exempt or qualified exempt. In any case, it's still important to know about food safety. Many of you in this room may even have GAP certification. You guys probably already know this, but of course, food safety is important for business risks, managing business risks, keeping customers safe, and also meeting those buyer demands. So we often get asked the question, what's the difference between GAP and FSMA? GAP is a voluntary certification, and FSMA is a mandatory rule. So with GAP, while it's voluntary, you may have buyers that are requiring it. So in that case, it very much might not feel voluntary. Keep in mind that FSMA is a federal regulation. It's mandatory, but there may be you may be exempt from certain aspects of the rule. So that's kind of the dichotomy there. Another analogy I've heard used is that GAP sets the ceiling and FSMA sets the floor, meaning that FSMA sets minimum base requirements for growing, harvesting, and packing of produce. Your buyer can set any kind of demands on you that they want, as they kind of set the marketplace. So in a lot of cases, and sometimes we'll see that GAP standards have even stricter requirements than FSMA. And a lot of GAP certifiers are adding addendums for FSMA that you can add on to your FSMA audit to show alignment with the produce safety rule. At this time, your GAP certification will not replace a FSMA inspection. So we'll still need to come out and verify if you, and that would be from within our staff. So these are new faces to know, and Beth is our local contact, so get to know her. And we're gonna have Ellie come up and tell us a little bit about another resource that we have.
Hi there. Again, my name is Ellie Watts. I'm on the regional markets team at WSDA, which is a separate program from the produce safety program. We are the small farm direct marketing and farm to school program. We do a lot of helping connect Washington growers with Washington markets, whatever those may be. So farm to school is a big component. We also work with other institutional buyers and help foster those connections to enhance the regional economy. So one of the resources that we have developed over time is called the Bridging the Gaps Guide. I'm curious if anyone is familiar with a manual that looks like this, Bridging the Gaps. We found that one of the big needs of small, mid-scale, and diversified farms who want to access these regional markets is food safety certification. So we developed a step-by-step guide for these farms to be able to successfully complete a USDA basic GAP-GIP audit. And with the implementation of the FSMA produce safety rule, there's a very strong desire for additional education and resources of how farms, and in particular small and diversified farms, can meet these FSMA standards. In some cases, the farms will be covered, and in other cases where they may be exempt or qualified exempt based on their size and their markets, there's still an interest to know what the standards are. Some buyers are requiring that farms follow FSMA standards, even if they're technically not covered. And so farms are facing a lot of pressures to understand and be able to implement and acknowledge what these FSMA produce safety rule standards are. So we have recently updated the Bridging the Gaps Guide to include FSMA produce safety rule standards. The produce safety rule there's a lot of overlap with GAP standards. So if you're familiar with the basic GAP-GIP audit, you're pretty familiar with a lot of the standards that the produce safety rule will set. But there are important differences between the two. And so in this, we walk through what the different requirements are for post-harvest handling and for worker training and all these things, and note where there is similarities and differences between the two programs. We're trying to help demystify what the produce safety rule standards are. Because GAP has been around for a lot longer, we sort of use that as a basis of familiarity for people to do these practices. Our team is available for trainings, and we also offer this guide to farmers for free. If it's something that seems applicable to you, it's really aimed at small, diversified farms. We offer examples of scale appropriate and cost effective ways to implement some of these food safety practices on diversified and small farms. But again, as I mentioned, a lot of our work is to sort of translate and demystify what the produce safety rule means for farmers who may be concerned about the sort of burdensomeness of implementing these food safety practices. So one of the things that we like to cover is that you're probably, regardless of the size of your farm, already practicing many of these food safety best practices. It may be that you need to take the next step and document them for a food safety program, whether that's GAPS or whether that's the produce safety rule. But just some really basic things is ensuring that you have bathrooms and hand washing facilities for your workers that are stocked and accessible. That's required under both programs. It's also just a best practice so that workers can wash their hands after using the bathrooms. Ensuring that your employees are trained in basic health and hygiene practices to be able to identify when they're ill and should not be handling produce. They've gone over the standards for soil amendments specifically if they have animal components in them, but just you're probably keeping records and have a informed program of when you're applying soil amendments and maintaining those records for food safety standards in addition to your own production practices. Again, deterring animals from your crop production and not harvesting when there are feces on the product. Probably don't want to do this anyway because you don't want to sell that to your customers. But again, there's the overlap with good production standards and food safety standards.
And quality.
Hmm?
And quality.
And quality, yeah. So again, they talked about if you're not already testing your agricultural water, now is a good time to start, just to start understanding the water that you're working with and eventually to be in compliance with the testing protocols for the produce safety rule if you're not already doing it for your other food safety programs. Ensuring that the water that you use during harvest and post-harvest activities, hand washing, cleaning produce if you are washing it, food contact surfaces, making sure that's potable, so no detectable E. coli. Keeping your harvest bins off the ground during harvest, so having some barrier between the dirt and those bins. Replacing equipment or ensuring it's good condition through maintenance. If it's a hard to clean material, potentially replacing that equipment with something that is easier to clean and sanitize so you're not cross-contaminating your produce with the equipment. And then again, setting and maintaining a sanitizing schedule, which is appropriate for your farm. You do get to determine what's appropriate. Your input from your buyers and your packers will help you determine what's appropriate for your farm. So this isn't a free pass to, never sanitize because that's what you determine is reasonable. You'll have some input from your consumers and industry standards of what is a good harvest schedule. So in terms of, here's a quick quiz for you. Packing and packaging materials. So after you've taken your product out of your harvest bins and you're sending it either to your packing houses, you're putting it in containers for your direct-to-consumer sales. What does FSMA say are allowable packing and packaging materials that can be reused? So does anyone think that only packing materials such as harvest bins and crates, that's the only thing that you can put your produce in? Nope. Only cardboard packaging materials with a clean liner. So fresh liner each time. Nope. Only packing and packaging materials that are not wood. Nope. Or all food contact surfaces that can be cleaned and sanitized. Yes. Great. So again, this is one of those areas where it's up to you to determine what is reasonable. The standard is that it must be able to be cleaned and sanitized. So you get to determine if the materials that you're using, if they're able to be sanitized, then that's fine for your operation.
I just want to add to that. If I do come in and I see that, you're using some sort of food contact surface that's visibly dirty also, you should know when it's time to clean and clean and sanitize your bins, and same thing with your production and equipment. So, it's going to be variable, but there's definitely, you should know when to do it.
So if you have any questions about our regional markets program in particular, any of the services or resources that we offer, if you're interested in picking up or just looking through one of these guides, come talk to me at the table afterwards and I'd be happy to chat with you.
Okay, I'm up again. All right, so I want to take the next section to give you an update on kind of FDA's perspective on the rule right now. Surprise, surprise, things are taking a little bit longer to roll out than expected. It does take a while to modernize our whole federal food safety law, and it's so there's been some updates and news in the last year. The two that I'm going to cover, one is water, and the second one is the farm definition, to give you guys an update of where we're at. Okay. We've already talked about water a little bit. We know that it's a good idea to at least inspect annually your water systems for debris. Pooling water. Is your water treatment working? Are there breaks in your pipelines? Is your Is your water pump cracked? Is there surface water? You know, things like that. You want to be doing a visual inspection every year. If you can, it would also be a good idea to write down that you did a visual inspection. That would be a good best practice that we would look for under the rule. The second piece is that really when it comes down to it, we don't really know the quality of our water unless we test it. This is how the rule looks at water right now. It breaks the quality standards into based on how the water is used, and it breaks it into two categories: your production water and your post-harvest water. Production water is everything before harvest. Post-harvest water is everything during harvest and after harvest. So these are probably familiar concepts for you guys. Your production water standards are different from your post-harvest water standards. Your post-harvest water standards are what are most strict, because that's what you may be washing your produce with, or your hands, washing your hands that are essentially could be food contact surfaces. For water used in any of these applications, you're going to be wanting to use no detectable E. coli. That's essentially potable water. That's unlikely to change at any point in time. However, the testing standards for production water have been a bit contentious for various reasons that I'll get into. There's a lot of questions that have come up since the rule was finalized back in 2015, and now we're in 2018, and we're still kind of scratching our heads, because quite honestly, FDA is looking at doing more research to reassess both the frequency of testing, the type of testing indicator. So right now, in the rule, it tests for generic E. coli as an indicator organism, meaning we're not testing exactly for the organism, it's exactly testing for the pathogen itself. We're testing for something that tends to indicate that there might also be a correlating factor of pathogens in your water source. So things like E. coli and Salmonella. Those are the types of pathogens we're concerned about when it comes to food safety. As the rule is written right now for production water, these are the two standards that are written in the rule currently. These calculations are derived after taking multiple samples of your water and doing calculations. Today, we're not going to dive into what those calculations are and what they mean, but they essentially give you a sense of what your average water, what your water quality is on average over time, and what the variation is in that average over time. There's lots more trainings that we'll point you to that you can go and learn more about what the water section is. But I just wanted to highlight that this is the section of the rule that they're looking at reassessing. And the reason they're reassessing this is because there's been a lot of questions of what is a representative sample of your water. The rule is, at this point, fairly vague as to what that is. FDA defines a representative sample as something as close to harvest as practical. And it doesn't define a specific location or how that water or testing doesn't specify like where on the property necessarily to be testing. So there's been lots of questions from farms. Okay, well, what if I have multiple properties? Or what if I have multiple irrigation heads? Or what if I'm doing a lot of crop rotation? Do I still need to be doing my water analysis for, say I rotate between potatoes and another row crop that's covered, like kale. What if I'm rotating between those crops? Potatoes aren't covered. Do I still need to be maintaining my water quality for water I'm using on that source? So there's been lots of questions that have come up on that. There's also been questions of, can I share water samples along an irrigation canal? So these are questions that FDA is currently looking into. So at this point in time, they're recommending that farms continue to do what you're doing, particularly as it relates to your buyer requests and requirements for gap standards or otherwise. If you have not done any testing, it would be a good idea to do some testing to have some sense of what your water quality is. We know that testing is an important aspect of knowing your water source. But at this point, FDA is not enforcing anything related to the water section, meaning that you do not need to do a high frequency of testing in order to meet the standard as it's written. So in order to meet depending on your water source for the geometric mean and standard deviation calculations, it can be up to, for surface water, as the rule's written right now, 20 samples over 2 to 5 years to calculate those averages. So at this point, you do not need to invest in trying to meet those standards, but continue to do what you're doing for Bayer or other risk management activities that you want to do for your own operation. And you can look to FSMA as a frame of reference if you get water samples back. You can look and assess and compare, oh, where do I seem to fall generally? And then you can make some, corrective action decisions or practice decisions based on that.
And if you are doing that kind of evaluation of your system, your water system now, and do have questions, feel free to reach out to us. If you do get water samples back and have questions about them, feel free to contact us. And also when I'm doing an inspection, even though I'm not fully evaluating a water system, I can gladly walk through the system with you and go over any sort of corrective actions. At the moment, we can still go over that stuff. So.
Yeah. And I'll just add on to that right now. Our first inspections that we're doing really are intended to be educational based. So we really want to be there with you guys through this process. We do not want to blindside anyone in terms of what we're going to be looking at or requiring. Unlike an auditor who needs to be a very unbiased source on your farm and cannot provide any recommendations, we can be there to help you brainstorm and think through what would be applicable to your farm.
Right.
So the good news is that FDA is looking into this question of water quality a lot. Of course, we had the recent, the Yuma, the romaine outbreak in Arizona, the Yuma one in Arizona. It really is not conclusive as to whether water was the contamination source in that system, although water tends to be what we target as the culprit in these circumstances, so it gets a lot of attention. We do know that based on research, for example, here in Yakima, UC Davis did come out and is doing some current testing right now. So you see in this chart, they are testing both upstream from a dairy and downstream from a dairy, and also at the paralleling river up the slope, and they are finding that the dairy has an effect on the water sources. So this is just to say that FDA is looking into doing more research into this area so we can really better nail down what is the right test to do and what is the right type of frequency for these for systems that can really be, there's a lot of change that happens in our environment. So research is happening. So there's been a couple of other, I would say, wins for farmers in terms of this. So what FDA has done is proposed to extend the water compliance dates. You saw that in the chart previously. So they've proposed to extend it to 4 years beyond your general compliance date. We are not enforcing the water section at this time during this compliance period. FDA has also extended the list of methodologies that are allowed. So methodologies meaning the tests that labs do, the types of methodology testing that labs do for testing like agricultural water sources. They've extended that list from 1 type of method specifically outlined in the rule to now, I think, 8 or 9. And they've also acknowledged that presence and absence tests would be adequate for post-harvest water use. So with your production water, when you go to get your water tested, you want both a presence-absence test of generic E. coli and also a numeric number of what the count is of pathogens in that sample. For post-harvest water, because it's no detectable E. coli, FDA has approved just a straight presence-absence test, so yes or no is generic E. coli in this sample. The benefit of that for you guys here is that presence-absence tests are generally cheaper than the other method. So Beth, why don't you hold up that sheet? So that sheet is in your folder if you want to look at that. I would, the methodologies would mean, if you're not a microbiologist, that might not mean a lot to you, but you can bring that to your lab and they can help you sort through what tests they do have available and help you understand what kind of results that would provide and what the costs would be. Generally, your production water methodology costs around $35 per sample. And there are resources. So Department of Ecology accredits labs throughout our state. They've got a list of labs. Historically, they're driven by requirements for like Department of Health and water, public water sampling. But you guys are kind of a new audience for them. So they're, you can look on their website to see what labs, what methodologies they do. You can also look on Washington State University's extension website, and they've got a list with a map, which is quite handy, and it shows you where the labs are and what tests they do. If the indicator on the map has two colors on it, that means that it provides both post-harvest and production water methodology testing. Okay. So I've already kind of gone over this, but the recommendation is to continue doing what you're doing. If you haven't sampled already, it would be a good idea to start doing some sampling. Okay, so while we're on the topic of water, I thought I would just throw in a trick question for you guys. So true or false? Does the FDA produce rule require farms to wash produce? Can I get like a shake of heads? Okay, so sometimes we get this question. So the answer is
the word too that we don't require that.
Yeah, so we do not require you to wash your product. If you don't wash your product, you're actually reducing a lot of risk because you're not introducing water, which may have which could easily spread pathogens if it's got pathogens in it. So it's not a requirement. I know that some buyers are going to expect washed produce, so that might not be an option to you. But if you can get away with not washing your product and do some buyer education, that would be reducing some of your risk. Okay.
A ton of questions from folks across. Can we go through some of them? Okay. And they go back, I think, from a while ago, so hang tight. If a grower has multiple sites, I assume that means field sites, will he be required to have a written assessment for each site based on physical address?
You can just use I'm assuming this question is referring to the qualified exemption labeling requirement, the source identification.
Hang tight. Gwen will text me in a second.
Okay.
I'll go to the next question. Okay.
Can you repeat that again?
Yes. Yeah. Her answer to your question was yes.
Okay. So I'm going to restate this. I think the question was, if you're a qualified exempt farm and are required to follow the labeling requirement, and you need to show your farm and business address on the label, you can use just a business mailing address. It doesn't have to be specific to the specific field or area if you have multiple farm locations. It can just be like a overall business address for your operation, like a mailing address.
Okay. Are wine grapes exempt?
Wine grapes may be...
oh, wait. Maybe that might have got answered.
So wine grapes are likely to fall under the commercial processing exemption, but they, at this time they're not excluded. However, they're not a priority crop for us. You saw that prioritization matrix. We're looking at high-risk foods for inspection. So
okay. If a grower has recently started farming, so new farmer, does he or she have 3 years to determine if he is exempt, if they're exempt based on financial records, or will they automatically be required?
Okay, so the question is, what if you're a new farmer and you don't really have sales records yet, or you're just starting up? The comments section of the rule actually covers this a little bit, but you can, if you don't have any sales records, you can do projections of what you think your sales are and base your threshold exclusion based on that. I think that might answer that question.
Okay.
Yeah, so keep in mind that we have 3 inspectors for 3,000 farms that we think are covered out of 40,000 in Washington state.
And we're only starting with a small portion of them the first year. So.
Anyways.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
So-
this might just come up in the future as well. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a good question.
Okay. At some point you referred to number 8, which referred to keeping bins off of the ground during harvest. Can you further explain that? Or I guess better define what keeping off of ground might be?
I mean,
I know this sounds silly.
I've seen people as simple as just taking an empty bin and putting it underneath all the other bins, and that's it. That's all we're looking
Okay.
for. Yeah.
Hey, Chris. Ben?
Couple
Hey,
more.
Chris.
In many farms, domestic animals are used as a tool for rodent control and food defense based on individual farm need. Is it acceptable under FSMA to have them written into the risk assessment as such?
So
I'm
all
thinking
animals
like
are
a
going
cat
to,
or something like that.
So we're going to find circumstances where we're going to see, domestic animals too. The same requirement's going to apply for your domestic animals, whether they're used for mitigation or not. The requirement is to try to keep them out of the crop production area.
Wait, hold on a second. Can you, Mike?
I just wanted to clarify, as a packer, when you're talking about keeping the harvest containers off the ground, we want to define when we use another bin, we want that to be a bin that is not used in harvest. So we don't want a clean flat on the ground with a flat that fruit's going into to be used. So we would want to make sure that's defined, just because we don't want growers to be contaminating those harvest containers with soil-borne pathogens during harvest, just to clarify. That's always an issue that is hard to combat. So,
the bin thing was referred to orchards. They line them up on the ground, and is that all right, or is the space for forklift, enough?
I think we're kind of getting down into a little bit
Too
case
much
by
details.
case
Okay.
circumstance.
It depends on the design of the containers. If there's a gap,
Okay. We'll
it's gonna
fast forward there.
common sense. Don't make it dirty, kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay. One last one at this point. How long does a grower have to submit corrective actions regarding a FSMA inspection? And is the information from these inspections shared, or does it remain confidential? And can you fail an inspection?
That's a good question. So I should give you a little bit of a higher level status update of where we are with inspections. So inspections, again, will be starting spring of next year. We are still in the development process stages of what the inspection documentation will look like from an internal perspective. We do not have a sense yet, and we're kind of waiting from a federal level to have a better handle of this, because we want to have consistency nationwide. We do not know yet what enforcement will look like in terms of inspections, in terms of whether, will there be a fine, or what will be the repercussions of that? It's still being determined. And Roger's going to add to that.
The primary focus for at least the initial inspections, it comes down to one simple question. If there's an imminent public health risk, we're going to have a discussion. If it looks like there's something that could cause an imminent public health risk, okay, that we have embargo capabilities and stuff. I don't think that's going to be a problem. I'm not worried about that. The first go around, we're going to have to find out what normal is. We have not been given a score sheet, so we don't know if we mark one thing down, if FDA says that's a failure, or if there's a bunch of things. As far as timelines to correct anything, if things are generally okay, it may be years before you see us again. The other issue is if we come out and there's some issues with harvest, okay, we're going to come back in 6 months. Well, there's nothing going on in 6 months, so that doesn't make any sense either. Now, there may be some cases where we can come back if there's a construction-related issue in your processing facility. that we can come back during off-season production, it's been addressed, then we can come back and take a look at that. Otherwise, a lot of this is going to be event-driven. So, and again, we don't know what the priorities are from the FDA. If things are generally fine, and that's the intent the first go-around, it is mostly education, again, barring any imminent public health issues, we'll come back and we'll get to you when we can. And to be honest with you, that could be years. We just don't know because there's a lot of farms out there yet and that sort of thing. So getting back to the thing, the question, is there a timeline? Well, as soon as possible, but depending on how bad it is and that sort of thing, we can come back later. We don't have an enforcement system set up yet, but the focus on the first go around is imminent public health risk. If there is none, and there might be some problems, we'll move on. We'll learn and move on. So bottom line, if it's not an embargo situation, we'll be fine.
Yeah. Building off that, what is a imminent public health risk? Another term you might hear us use is egregious. And we consider something to be egregious if we're seeing visual contamination of product, a visual contamination of product, and a root of how that contamination either is on there or somehow got there. So and it would have to be very explicit.
Yeah, consistent contamination kind of thing. Yeah.
We've got another question here.
On our farm, we do multiple fruit crops. We know some of it's going to be covered. On the strawberries that we sell, that we know that are processed, that are pasteurized in the end use, is that part of our operation exempt, or is everything still covered under FSMA because we have other crops that are covered?
It sounds like you may have a product exclusion in that case if you have some product that's going into commercial processing. The products exclusion would apply if you know that the processing step is going to involve some sort of kill step. Pasteurized. Okay. So in that case, that aspect of your crop would have an exclusion from the rule. So this is good timing for that question. So for those situations where there's a commercial processing step, we are not enforcing the requirement to show documentation to verify that it's going into that commercial processing step at this time, just because we need more guidance and clarity about what that documentation should look like. So if you think that may apply to you, please pick up this yellow fact sheet. It's going to be on the table over there. It's going to go over all those enforcement discretions. And when I say enforcement discretion, I mean we're not intending to enforce that aspect of the rule at this time until more guidance is available. Another thing that may come up for some folks in the audience is if you're a packing house or if you're a food hub and you seem to be falling in between the preventive controls rule and the produce safety rule. In some cases, if both apply, you may be considered a mixed type facility. And really, honestly, in some cases, you may just be in the gray area of these two definitions at this time. And the reason for that is FDA came out with a farm definition that consists of two parts. And quite frankly, some businesses don't fit squarely into the farm definition as FDA hoped or intended. So if you think you might be in that gray area, I'd also look to this document. So they're also applying enforcement discretion for packing houses, for example. So at this time, it's still unsure whether packing houses, would be inspected by this produce safety team, or if there would also be an inspection for WSDA food safety team, who tends to do the processing side of things. To get a little bit more into, okay, what does FDA define as farm? Well, FDA defines farm as growing, harvesting, packing, or holding product. Of course, your packing houses may be packing and holding product. That's why it gets confusing. Here are some examples of other, how they better define harvest, pack, and hold. The real break in the farm versus facility, if you're doing any kind of processing that takes the raw product takes it out of a raw state, you're probably doing some sort of processing. You probably, in this state, you're going to need a WSDA processing license. The only minimal processing that's required under the produce safety rule, or that's covered under the produce safety rule, is applying like fumigation, like ethanol to help ripen, or doing a dry dehydration because you're still preserving the raw product. So if you do any of these activities, it's likely that the produce safety rule applies to you. If you do this and more, both rules may apply, if that makes sense. If you're still confused, I would highly recommend the farm guide, because we added a whole chapter on FSMA, and that chapter goes quite in depth over that coverages section that we went over earlier in the other section of this presentation, and it provides a lot of additional narrative to go through those different flowchart steps and provide some examples of like, what about a food hub and how are we looking at it from a WSDA state perspective. An additional resource for you guys, which is also additional on the table, FDA just came out with a small business entity fact sheet that helps you determine if you have an exclusion as a facility from, there's some requirements in terms of, are you required to register or not, and what do you have to do to verify if you're a small business and may have some exclusions from the preventive controls rule for human food. So that documentation is there for you guys. Questions on that section? Okay, so the next section Jill's gonna talk about, okay, what can we do now? How are we here to help you guys through all of this?
All right, so before I wrap up our formal part of the presentation, I realized we didn't provide some specifics about our funding source and a little bit more about our program and also kind of our roles in the program. Roger, as we mentioned, is our program manager. My name is Jill Weishart. I'm the management analyst based in Olympia with Roger. So my role is more or less like operations manager. So I do the grant reporting and budgets and contract management and things like that. Beth, you've already met. She is our Northwest produce inspector. So she's going to focus on the Northwest, or primarily the west side of the state, for produce inspections. And Karen Ullman is our education and outreach coordinator, who has provided a wealth of information. And we are 100% funded by the FDA. So we don't receive any state dollars to conduct our programmatic activities. And we received our 5-year grant back in 2016. We are in our third of 5 years of the grant. So in 2021, it'll be the end of the first year of this cooperative agreement with FDA. And future funding will be dependent on what the FDA and I guess Congress decides on options. So to wrap up, what we're talking about today is what can you do now to be in alignment with the FSMA produce safety rule. And you probably are aware of the training requirement. So in order to be compliant with the rule, at least one supervisor or responsible party from the farm has to successfully complete a training that's recognized by the FDA. Currently, there's only one FDA recognized curriculum, and the Produce Safety Alliance developed that curriculum. And so the Produce Safety Alliance is a collaborative organization between Cornell University, the FDA, and the USDA. So one of our jobs is to disseminate this training across the state and make sure all of our growers have access to this training. And in your packets, we have a list of upcoming trainings. In 2019, there's 2 coming up. I think there's one in Mount Vernon, one in Anacortes that you can attend. That's closer to you.
Yeah, so this, that handout is in your packet. So the 2 that are coming up, this is really, we focus on hosting these over the winter. So if you want to go through this training within this next year, I would really emphasize going to one of these 2.
And I really recommend going to the Produce Safety Alliance website. They have a lot of great resources, and they continue to develop useful resources. One is a Spanish curriculum for the Produce Safety Alliance grower training that's available on the website right now. So I recommend checking out their website.
I guess I'll also add, if you work with growers or work with multiple growers or see a need for this kind of training, also work with us, and we can help provide that to you on an individual basis, or if there's workshops or if there's additional training needs that you think you might need, feel free to come and contact us.
Yeah. So again, these are the upcoming PSA trainings. The ones in orange are the ones closer to this region. And we have 2 links at the bottom. The WSU website has a lot of information about grower trainings and all the other helpful food safety trainings that they offer. And then on the left of the slide is the Produce Safety Alliance website that I mentioned that houses a lot of great resources. One thing that we are doing in Washington and actually across the country is rolling out on-farm readiness reviews. And there's also a flyer in your packet for this. And this is really a good opportunity to kind of see where you fall in terms of compliance with the rule. It's non-regulatory. It's more of a technical assistance visit. And one or more of our staff will come out and provide that individualized assistance. Look at your operation, look at the covered activities. Ideally, we would go out during covered activities, during harvest and things like that. It is voluntary, and it's of course offered at no cost. So we really highly recommend doing this. We can work with you, so feel free to contact Karen, and her contact information is in that flyer. And we can work with you to set up a good time that would work for you and your operation. Do you want to add anything else? Okay.
I was just going to say also, if you didn't want to do just a formal visit, you wanted to have a question and answer kind of sit down, document review type of thing, we can do that too if you're interested in something like that. So.
And we really see this as the next step after attending a Produce Safety Alliance training. We recommend going through that training in advance. It just gives you a good foundation of the rules. That way we can really kind of dig into what's applicable to your operation. When we come out to visit, you will get a full manual / notebook binder that breaks down. It has all the different aspects of the rule and also provides example ways that the rule could be implemented. So it's a deeper dive into what an inspection might look like than the Produce Safety Alliance training, which is more of a Food Safety 101 that merges both FSMA and GAP. So if you're wanting to better understand the rule itself and how it applies to you and prepare yourself for inspections, this would be a really good step. And it also may put you on a lower, kind of lower on the totem pole in terms of prioritization for future inspections. So I would highly recommend it.
A little bit more information on how to register. As I mentioned in the flyer, you have Karen's contact information, but you can also go to our website, our WSDA website, and we have an online survey monkey that you can submit to request an on-farm readiness review.
But if you're really excited, you can fill out this form today and hand it off to me, because these are kind of the baseline questions that we would need to know about your operation. Like, it asks questions about what do you grow, because we need to know if you have any excluded product or if you maybe have some exclusions for commercial processing. So we ask those basic questions to get that, get us each on the same page.
So I think that's all as far as our formal presentation. I don't know how much time we have left.
It's about 9:35, so maybe 25, half hour, somewhere in there.
So we have a good 20-ish minutes to answer any questions you have. Anything that we've covered or not covered?
And I assume if we stop, that you two, or the four of you, will be around for a little bit, and maybe people can ask questions directly, right?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Actually, just a comment for anybody that's looking for a good template for like water testing. UC Davis has a great Excel file that'll calculate the GM and STV for you.
Thank you, Riley.
There's just a couple things that, wait, can anybody hear me here? A couple notes I was taking through this just kind of for background information. State of Washington passed a law last year that essentially authorizes us to be here. The law is very specific. If we don't get any federal funding, there will actually be FDA inspectors coming to visit you from, I don't know where they're going to be from, but they're the ones that are going to come out and visit if we don't have the WSDA program. But it was very specific, is that there will be no state funding for this program. So if the federal funds dry up, we're going to go look for other jobs, and it'll be FDA inspectors here. And that was very specific. Also, in terms of records, when the inspector calls to set up a time for your inspections, one of the main things is to look at records review. Please, please, please do not send us electronic copies of your records. If they're sitting in our inbox, they're subject to public disclosure. Okay? So please don't send them to us. If you want, you can have it on your computer and bring it up on your computer, and we'll look at it. Some people have had it on their handheld devices, and we'll look at it. You can bring paper copies, and we'll look at it. But if you send them to us and they're sitting in our inbox, somebody somewhere is going to say, I want to see the records of farm so-and-so. And guess what? They're out there. So now, having said that, if it's for cause investigation and we have reason to believe there's an illness, all bets are off, okay? But as far as the routine stuff, we'll set something up in advance. We'll meet you off-site somewhere, whatever works for you and the inspector, because, again, this is going to vary within the state of Washington. And I think we touched a little bit. Yes?
How far in advance are the inspections scheduled? What's the...
You know, ideally a week or so.
Okay.
Mother Nature is going to get a vote in this. Hey, I'd like to come out and visit you next Thursday. Well, Wednesday night there's a big storm comes through, and guess what you're doing Thursday? You're not
But
harvesting.
produce inspections will happen during,
Yeah.
we're looking for ideally during harvest. And so unlike your GAP auditors, GAP audits, these are considered inspections, and there won't be any cost for us to come out, as this is a mandatory law.
And there are entities, the only real entity in the state of Washington we can inspect on a year-round basis is apple packing houses. Everybody else is pretty seasonal. And again, that kind of dovetails into something else here. This rule, like the grower training and stuff, it's a national curriculum. So as we sit here in the northern part of Washington, that same course is being taught in the southern part of Florida, the northern part of Maine, and the southwestern part of the lettuce growing region in California. So a lot of this is canned. So when we talk about washing harvest equipment and stuff like that, okay, we can't, they're not going to dictate it has to be done at this frequency. For things like that, other things may, you know, for in-use food contact surfaces may be different. So there's going to be some variability to that. So that's why some of this stuff is vague. And then we talked a little bit about the farm definition. FDA is starting to look at the actual events that a piece of fruit goes through as opposed to the business structure. And that would simplify things a lot. So
I just wanted to ask, I know I talked to you guys the other day about fruit coming in from Canada. I know it's kind of tricky, but there is fruit that gets shipped to Canadian packers, then shipped to the U.S. market. How does that play in with BSMA?
That actually, that falls under the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, and it's supposed to be certified in third countries. Anything that crosses an international border, there are people at FDA that deal with that process, the export, import, and that sort of thing. That's, I think we're probably going to, because given where we are, it's going to be more of an issue for us than the center part of the country. So we'll learn more as we go along, but exports and imports are primarily FDA issues. So they need to address that. Now, we may ask you those questions when we get there, just to kind of get a feel for things. But as far as the actual mechanics of implementing that program, that's purely FDA.
So it would be more on the customers in the United States requiring the packers in Canada to make sure
we'd have to get with us and we'll get the specific FDA. I'm not sure specifically how that works in terms of what FDA is looking at in terms of documentation, because you're right, because that's something we would need to see. Where did this fruit come from? It came from Farm X in Canada. Well, is the right stuff. Ideally, it's supposed to meet the same criteria. We'll see. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So farms in Canada that are selling product to Washington will also need to abide by the produce safety rule. So the same applies.
Yeah. The intent is the same, whether the actuality.
But we're focused on the Washington. We're focused on the Washington product. I mean, from a buyer perspective, you're buying product from another country. I mean, you can set your own buyer standards, whether that's GAP, whatnot. In terms of the state and federal regulations, that's kind of on us to make sure we do our job and confirm and verify.
We're gonna see that.
NFDA.
Anything else? Any other questions?
You can get with us as we're kind of floating around too, if there's
Okay.
any specific.
Let's thank all four of you for presenting today. Thank you. So we'll take, for those sticking around for the respiratory training, that starts up at 10:15. So we've got about a half an hour or so. And we're going to have to do some table moving around in here. So we'll see you then.
I don't think I have. Yeah.